Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sherry Miles Cohen, and I'm the Senior Director of the American Psychological Association's Human Rights Team. It's my pleasure to moderate today's panel, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Whither Human Rights. When Dr. Gabe Tews approached us about this panel, he asked us to consider this question: how are systemic racism, health inequities, and other disparities connected to human rights? It's a question that many organizations and practitioners are seeking to understand. Really, how to frame equity, diversity, and inclusion as part of their human rights initiatives. This session will address this issue through three interrelated components. An academic leader will provide an overview of connections between EDI and human rights. Representatives from three associations, the American Psychological Association, the American Political Science Association, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, will discuss their organizational efforts to address EDI with a human rights lens. And an applied practitioner will explain how on-the-ground EDI work can be based upon a human rights framework. At the conclusion of the prepared remarks, I will invite each panelist to share a reflection on what they've heard today. And for those of you in the audience, please use the chat function to submit your questions. We have reserved the last 15 minutes of the panel to address your questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our five panelists. First, Anna Spain Bradley, JD, is the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a professor of law at UCLA Law School. An expert in international law and human rights, Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley is the author of Human Choice in International Law, published by Cambridge University Press this year, Global Racism, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press, and numerous scholarly articles, including Human Rights Racism, which I just reread in advance of this panel. Thank you for being here, Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Maisa Akbar, PhD. Dr. Akbar is a respected scientist practitioner charged with infusing equity, diversity, and inclusion into the fabric of APA's work. Dr. Akbar is a leader and expert in EDI. Her areas of specialty include racial identity development, racism, urban trauma, and allyship, topics on which she has written research articles, books, and book chapters. And I'll introduce our next three speakers, and then we'll turn the floor over to Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley. Kimberly A. Mealy, PhD, is the Senior Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the American Political Science Association. She is also the lead staff support for the APSA Committee on Professional Ethics, Rights, and Responsibilities, and the APSA Presidential Task Force on Systemic Inequities. She designed and implemented the APSA Annual Meetings Ombuds resource and the APSA Respect campaign, which promotes respectful and ethical conduct. Travis T. York, PhD, is the Director of Inclusive STEM Ecosystems for Equity and Diversity at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. York's research and work focus on catalyzing and sustaining systemic change and transformation to achieve inclusive and equitable access and progress through STEM pathways into the STEM workforce. And our final speaker today will be Jacqueline Patterson, the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. Most recently, Patterson served for 11 years as the Senior Director of Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. She has addressed separately and intersectionally the issues of gender, racial, economic, and environmental justice. Our first panelist speaking will be Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley, who will provide an overview of connections between EDI and human rights. And pardon me for speaking over you, Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. and all the expertise out there in the audience. I want to thank each and every one of you who are tuning in for taking the time and energy to care about this really important topic. Today in America and around the world, many people, communities, and governments, organizations too, are engaged in important and complex conversations about how to pursue diversity, what equity requires, and the deeper meanings of inclusion. At the same time, the world's commitment to advancing human rights has never been more needed. In my opening remarks today, and with thanks to all of you for attending and to the American Association for the Advancement of Science for making this gathering possible, I have been asked to help situate the pursuit of human rights with the call for equity, diversity, and inclusion. As Vice Chancellor for EDI at UCLA, I work on these areas in a number of ways. We also work through the lens of civil rights in addition to human rights. And organizations like mine and yours are often trying to respond to the increasing call today, and indeed demands, for change and for help. On the other side, as a human rights scholar, educator, and advocate, I have been on the side of the demands of calling for action and working for change. And because of these two frameworks to my own experience, I have a particular lens through which I connect and understand both of these calls to action. One that situates the core purpose shared by both human rights and equity, diversity, and inclusion in all that we do. And I really appreciate the focus of this session to bring this conversation together with science and technology. So let us start by returning to 1948. The world had just come out of the horrific Second World War, and nations of the world were motivated to declare human rights as being inherent, fundamental, and universal. They did so in a groundbreaking document known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a milestone document because it was the culmination of different legal, national, and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world agreeing on a common standard of achievements for all peoples in every nation. And it set out for the first time a fundamental framework for how to think about human rights that recognized, quote, the inherent dignity, the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as a foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in our world. This declaration was not a treaty. It was not binding on nations. However, it did set the foundational set of norms that led to the development of the human rights legal framework, the treaty-based framework that we enjoy today. In 1965, we received the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. In 1966, the world agreed to create the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. 1979, we get the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW. 1984, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment. 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there are other conventions and treaties. None of that would have been as expeditious or as possible without the groundbreaking moment of the world coming together around this idea of universal human rights. However, the conceptualization of human rights in 1948 is imperfect. There have been important critiques in the human rights field looking at how we understand human rights. This framework that we have today is based on the idea of individuals and individual rights with obligations owed by nations. There are others who suggest a different way, that the right framework is group rights, the rights owed by the community to the community, and the obligations that every individual has themselves in addition to organizations, companies, universities, and nations. This conversation is going to come back up in a moment when we consider the EDI connection. But the UN-backed framing of human rights did allow for a world in which we have some consensus about certain things that are so egregious to humanity, they cannot be allowed. In international law, we use the Latin jus cogens, which is peremptory norms. The acts are so illegal and so abhorrent that they cannot be allowed. These include slavery, genocide, piracy, and torture, just to name a few. But there are major gaps in our human rights law today. And I've written about this in some of the notable ways in which international law itself has a racism problem, and how human rights in particular has failed to address racism in all of its forms. National and local efforts to promote human rights and civil rights have also missed their mark. Despite anti-discrimination laws and equal protection rights, racism, hate crimes, white supremacy, and more threatened peace and security in this country and around the world, and indeed threaten the very core tenets of democracy. After the video of George Floyd's brutal murder went viral on the internet, it sparked a cry built on the deaths and murders of far too many Black and brown people that echoed around the world. These cries in turn sparked calls for action, calls for change, and those sparked responses. One such response has been framed in the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The call for education, for training, for programs, and more that companies and universities have taken up and wrapped in the language of advancing diversity, inclusion, and sometimes equity. Here, data often reveals what victims of discrimination and exclusion already know. Bias is rampant. Pay inequities are commonplace. People with certain identities are persistently presumed to be incompetent. In academia, these barriers to EDI, DEI show up in particular ways. In unfair assessments of academic excellence linked to promotion, in unreasonable expectations of who should bear extra service, in inappropriate calls for underrepresented peoples to be the ones to solve the problems that they didn't create. Sometimes organizations and groups strive to show they are diverse without giving critical attention to representation. And the focus on diversity without inclusion can be cruel. Why hire or attract a person to join your organization when their experience in that organization is doomed to be exclusionary because of toxic culture? It is at these margins where the fabric often tears and people return to the safety of their home at night in tears that we see just how human rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion should and should not fit together. Human rights violations often take root in places and spaces that have ignored or outright denied diversity, equity, and inclusion. And DEI efforts are no substitute for the deeper, harder, and often more painful work of structural change to root out discrimination and similar ills. But human rights and DEI have a second and brighter connection. What happens when you get DEI right? What happens when people enjoy human rights and are protected from all that would violate those rights? The answer on a foundational level is the very same: dignity. Dignity. We all get the experience of dignity, which is the fundamental norm underlying our universal human rights structure and underlying DEI. Simply put, dignity is the experience of being inherently valued because you are human. Dignity is the fundamental building block to any peaceful society, for where dignity is absent, the resort to violence is strong. Instead of asking, how do you or your company or university or group advance DEI, we might ask a different question. How do you advance dignity? I have many thoughts on this, and I've written about this in a recent book, but I'll share a few of that here. 3 things. First, start with what I call identity awareness, which is valuing and understanding people exactly as they seek to be known. In today's world, and in this country in particular, there are important conversations about disability versus ableism, about how we categorize and understand the diversity within gender and gender expression, how we think about the intersections between national origin and race, indigenous status, sexual orientation, and so much more. We must always ask whose perspectives are at the center versus the periphery, and then seek to center the periphery. And I'll give an example. When we think about sexual orientation, we often hear some people celebrate coming out to the community about your true identity. And we should also ask, who's not asked to come out? Short answer is people who identify as heterosexual or straight are not often asked by societies to re-identify themselves. They're not asked to come out. This is the center versus the periphery. Second, we need to look at how attacks on our identities become attacks on our dignity, whether framed as human rights violations or as discrimination or racism, etc. And we need to understand how these attacks actually work. And here I give a story about this in the book that I'm writing now called Global Racism. When I was 5 and my best friend and I were playing, and a stranger kid who was I didn't know him, wanted me to leave. And at age 5, he called me the N-word, which is the first time I remember being called that. And I talk about what happened and what happened inside for a 5-year-old, that a little bit of my dignity was taken from me that day. And there wasn't an easy recourse for me that day at age 5 to get it back. When we attack people's identity because we deem certain identities to be superior and others to be inferior, these attacks work by dehumanizing individuals and communities, not only by denying their inherent equality and dignity, but by doing so often on the basis of a constructed category of human identity. And when we think about race being one example of this, race, as the UN in its 1950 UNESCO report called the Race Question deemed, was made up. It was constructed. And we would critique that today and say it was constructed for the very purpose of separating people into a hierarchy meant to elevate some and suppress many. Racial superiority is an ideology. It's a tool of oppression employed around the world, and its very nature is insidious because it's often rendered invisible by those who benefit from social capital, economic power, and political currency that comes from exercising it, even as they use it to maintain their place of power within social hierarchies. Racism and so many forms of discrimination did not only deny our identities, they are the thief of our dignity. Finally, and third, let us consider the world we want to build. Let us consider how a world designed to achieve dignity would differ from one trying to merely advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, or advance human rights. This is back to centering. If we center dignity as the first approach, it means that every part of your life and work, of our government, of our structures, of our economic and social and cultural plans in a society are designed to achieve dignity, not just avoid the violation of human rights. The very foundations of things would be committed to this norm. And that would be a very fundamentally different way to approach life in the world and on this planet. And it's one that the climate crisis might and will, I believe, demand us to consider. So as we engage today in the fantastic panel with this very distinguished group about thinking and indeed feeling about these important themes, I ask each of you to take in one idea. How would you show up in your day and in your world, ready to give and ready to receive dignity from every encounter? This, I believe, is how we're going to be able to build the world we seek to live in, but we have to do it together. Thank you, and looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley, for naming dignity as the way of grounding us with the overview of the discussion with human rights and the EDI lens. In our next 30 minutes or so, Doctors Akbar, Muley, and York will share how their organizations approach EDI with a human rights lens by responding to a series of questions that I have for them. And so we'll start with just the way you're organized on the screen. We'll start with Dr. York. And the first question is, how do you see your discipline as contributing to EDI as a human rights issue?
Well, it's a pleasure being with you all today. And I just want to thank the organizers for putting together such a thoughtful panel and session, and I really appreciated the Chancellor's opening remarks. I was really excited to hear from Anna. So within AAAS, I think this question is somewhat interesting since we are a multidisciplinary society, and so since within AAAS we represent all STEM disciplines, including medicine as well, and so I think we tend to think about this intersection quite holistically and kind of in line with the comments that we just heard. We certainly think a lot about how science is a human right, or what is the human right to science within AAAS. And I think it's quite interesting that oftentimes we have these kind of siloed ideas around what is human rights and what is DEI, J, or different amalgamations of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So like JEDI is a nice acronym. And I think oftentimes there's been a proliferation of thinking about human rights in particular as restrictions on what governments can or cannot do, and thinking perhaps a little bit more around DEI in terms of spaces where policy has not gone far enough and where cultural change might need to occur. And I think that kind of division may not be a space that we want to continue kind of thinking about these two topics separately. And so I think within AAAS, we've been thinking a lot about how are these two previously, I think in an American context, how are these two ideas, how have they been historically separated, and what would it look like to actually think about them in greater tandem, and what would it look like for us to really think about the rights to science and the implication that the right to science as a human right would have on areas of education, health, progress, and policy. I'm intrigued to hear my colleagues' responses to this question too.
So am I, Dr. York, and I'd like to ask sort of Dr. Akbar to respond relative to the discipline of psychology.
Thank you, Dr. Miles Cohen, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a really important question in terms of psychology's role in human rights. And what I'll say to that is that over, the decades of our organization being the leaders in psychology, we've been involved in human rights in a different capacity over time. Under our current leadership and in our most recent strategic plan, one of the guiding principles actually and the core values is to infuse in all of our organizational initiatives a respect to promote human rights. APA has actually shifted its focus to take a systemic approach to apply psychology to human rights, to fairness and dignity for different segments of society. And what we've done actually in 2016, the board of directors appointed a task force to advise the organization in its work to promote and protect human rights. This was really a key step for us towards creating a structure that will ensure this commitment, not just then, not just before, but from here on in terms of human rights and the association's work. I want to add that we are truly embracing a global perspective when we are thinking about psychology, and that whether we're talking about APA's science, practice, education, or public interest directorate, we are advancing the discipline globally through our international engagements and establishing meaningful collaborations with scientific organizations just like AAAS, but also with the United Nations. And to sum it up, I want to make sure that I make these 5 important connections. They're not hierarchical, but they certainly are the ones that our task force on human rights recommended that we as a discipline of psychology follow. The first one is psychology possess human rights by virtue of being human, as well as specific rights essential to their profession and the discipline. Psychologists should apply their knowledge and methods to greater realization of human rights. Psychologists should respect human rights and oppose the misuse of psychological science, practice, and application to be used in any negative way to impact human rights. Psychologists should advance equal access to the benefit of psychological science and practice. And most importantly, psychologists should advocate for human rights at all times. So for us, as we're looking at the discipline and as we're looking at psychology and the future of psychology, we understand that we must be anchored in human rights in all aspects of what we do.
Thank you, Dr. Akbar. Dr. Mealy, from the perspective of political science.
Thank you, Dr. Miles Cohen. I'd like to start by saying that the discipline of political science is uniquely positioned to help us to better understand how and why EDI is a human rights issue. Political scientists pose and answer innovative research questions on political behavior and conflict and the role of government and societal institutions. Political scientists also address research questions specifically focused on issues like human rights abuses, transitional justice, and conflict and resolution, all in the domestic and the global context. Other types of political science scholarship and research, and that which often is produced by scholars from historically underrepresented and marginalized groups, focuses on individuals' relationship to institutions, to power, to access, and to representation. This scholarship examines political behavior, civil rights, as well as oppression and harm resulting from various laws and policies and political and social institutions. This research is invaluable and helps us to understand power dynamics and informs how we think about concepts like equality and equity and justice and human agency. Examples of political science research fields and subfields that help us to better understand how equity and diversity and inclusion play out in the real world, or how these values might actually be thwarted or denied to certain groups include fields like race, ethnicity, and politics, human rights, a subfield like political psychology or comparative politics, fields like sexuality and politics, as well as accessibility politics, just to name a few. We have over 50 field and subfield designations that scholars can join and find mentors through and collaborators. However, within the discipline of political science, there has been a historical exclusion and marginalization of scholars of color and the study of race, ethnicity, and politics that began with the founding of the association in 1903. This exclusion was noted by Dr. Ralph Bunche in the 1940s when he pondered the lack of political science journals publishing articles on Black politics, as well as promoting Black scholars. More recently, it has also been documented by political scientists that the association and the discipline of political science has racist and white supremacist origins. We must ask, and we are asking, what is the enduring impact of these origins? To that end, a task force has been working on addressing systemic inequalities and systemic inequities. They've just completed their work, and we are looking forward to their recommendations that they will put forth for the association. We as an association and as scientists and as scholars must promote and amplify and center the work of scholars who challenge exclusion and systemic racism, all the while producing important scholarship on social and political phenomena and teaching and mentoring countless scholars along the way. It's imperative that we address EDI and that we view it through a human rights perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Mealy. And that folds right into our next question, which is to describe the EDI work of your association. And Dr. Akbar, I'd just like to ask you to begin this round by talking about how you see it building from a human rights framework.
Thank you, Dr. Miles Cohen. You know, as the Chief Diversity Officer at the American Psychological Association, I'm tasked with this question all the time. And it's one of the things that I ponder around. You know, you might think like, what do I do in my quiet time? So in my quiet time, I think about these questions, right? Like, how do I define equity, diversity, and inclusion? And you know, I see it as a goal that has to be fused through a human rights framework. In fact, it's really hard for me to detangle how we can do any type of, we call it EDI at APA, any type of EDI work without looking at this with disconnecting it from a human rights framework. So because human rights must be guaranteed for all, and to the degree that we are actualizing that, and we understand its dependence on power and privilege, and we understand that when we're violating human rights, what we're doing is denying those with marginalized identity the path that they deserve to live free and to live with liberation and to live with dignity, then we can't dismantle those things and separate them. Although sometimes I think that the field tends to do that and silo these components as if they don't belong together. So, if you ever wonder what I was thinking about, those are the things that I think about at night. But I have more to say about this. I think that the same thing that we can say related to a human rights framework, we must have those conversations related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in order to create sustainability and meaningfulness in both of these spaces, it is vital for organizations to be intentional, meaning that we can't check boxes and say that we've done the work. We can't check the diversity box and say we're done with this, because what is most important in terms of impact is how that diversity applies to inclusion and to equity and to belongingness. In fact, Sherry, I just had a full conversation about this a couple hours ago with the staff. And those approaches must be necessary and they must be put in place. But most importantly, we have to identify what are going to be the accountability metrics. Because if we're not held accountable, then we can deny, our role and our own personal responsibility in that. We can say that it is the responsibility of the organizations, but people make up the organizations, people make up systems. And so it's so important for us to look at this from not just the perspective of DEI or EDI or JEDI, but also from the perspective of human rights. I want to talk a little bit specifically about APA and what we've been doing in terms of our strategic thoughtfulness related to this. And some really, I'm calling them foundational steps. Our leadership are calling it foundational steps because we know that this is really the beginning of a very, very long process. And we're working on specific deliverables that are going to focus on that accountability piece. We know that there has to be an opportunity for us to look back and to understand where our field has contributed to historical harms to marginalized communities in multiple ways. We know that it's important that the first step is that we look inward, because we can't talk about how we are going to apply equity, diversity, and inclusion, or speak to how we're going to dismantle systems of oppression if we don't take a look at ourselves first. So I appreciate the conversation about that in terms of political science. It is a necessary first step. I think that the other piece of this is that we have to look at it throughout many different lenses. Not only that psychology looks at this from a historical perspective and from a human rights perspective, but that we also make a bold stand to make sure that we are uncovering that history and that we are taking responsibility for that history, and that we are taking actionable steps to repair and reconcile for those harms. And through some of the work of our incredible psychologists who have started to conceptualize the meaningfulness of an apology process, we know that absent of these three things, we will not fulfill the requirements that are necessary for us to be able to apologize in any discipline for harms that we have caused. I want to also take a look back, because I think it's important that we understand that there were catalyst moments that occurred in the last, few years between COVID and the racial reckoning that really prompted or accelerated a jumpstart into this work. But it doesn't mean that there weren't historic giants in our field that didn't advocate for this beforehand, but were unfortunately ignored or set aside. And for our particular history in the 1960s, where there were activism groups and Black psychologists who challenged APA to reflect and respond to the lack of diversity in its membership, to respond to the civil rights movement in a meaningful kind of way, we took a very passive and complicit role in that process. And we didn't activate our science. We didn't activate what we know about psychology for the good of human rights at that moment. And we have to reckon with that past. I think that for several decades after that, we've been trying to take measurable steps to move forward in this space, and how to make this work substantive so that it has impact, and how to truly address the concern of historically marginalized and minoritized groups. And that piece is so important, the listening piece, because I think that we can sit behind closed doors, we can sit in elevated levels and determine what's best for other communities without truly listening to what they need. And we have a responsibility, all of us who practice in spaces that, that are elevating science in our particular discipline, to say, it is not just about the science. It is also about the lived experience of people who have, endured the harms that we've been talking about.
And so, Dr. Akbar, I'm just going to just,
I was going to wrap it up.
You off because I'm so into what you're saying. But I do want to turn to Dr. York. He's been nodding sort of vociferously, particularly when you talked about intentionality and accountability. And I wanted to invite him to sort of join in this part of the conversation.
At first, I just want to say, Dr. Akbar, thank you. I was nodding vociferously. Wonderful word, Dr. Miles Cohen. I think there are a lot of commonalities here, and with similar things that AAAS has been working on. And really, I think a lot of this work, thankfully, has been done in our larger association, somewhat in tandem and somewhat in competition. And I welcome those levers for change. In my opening remarks, I kind of talked about this kind of framework that we begin with around the kind of the human right to science. And I think that we think about in cascading kind of a waterfall situation. So the right to science, or the right to having access to science, as being a foundational part of that human rights formation, and being kind of the access and equitable access to that. The second space of that being the right to be included within science, and thinking in particular in areas of health disparities, the ways that questions are formed, what questions are allowed to be asked, being in the space where we think about this framework around what science gets to be done, and are all members of our society being represented in that in that kind of inclusion of science, so that the science that is conducted is representing the greatest number of individuals. Lots of cases here where that historically has not been done, in particular for women and women of color, where science has not necessarily included them, and therefore the resources and learning has not included them. And then as a third kind of space, the right to do science, and where we kind of think about ways that we are opening up and really promoting opportunities for those who have historically not just been withheld from science, but actually pushed out of science, are included. And that really takes what I would call specific efforts towards systemic change, not just increasing the capacity of individuals to navigate systems of talent development and systems into science, but thinking really about how the structures and pathways into STEM need to fundamentally change and evolve to really include greater numbers of people. And so within those spaces, very much like my colleagues have already mentioned, Dr. Mueller and Dr. Akbar, AAAS has taken a very concerted effort, not just in the last several years and months, which have been, I think, the growing resurgence of racial justice that has been the moment of the past couple of years, is in the line of a long series of responses, many of which historically have not led to the level of change that we would have liked to see. And so thinking about what is that history, where are the spaces that we have either been complicit or in fact active in science not being used for the good of all society, and how we start to change that. And so Within AAAS, we have been doing a lot of shedding lights on that. We recently had an article in Science, which is the science family of journals are part of AAAS, where we really looked at the history of where science that has come out of AAAS and been published even in the science family of journals has not been A, good science, and B, has been used disproportionately to affect marginalized communities, like the use over 100 years ago of eugenics to codify issues of race, which we know is completely false and now thankfully been disproven. So we've been doing that both kind of mirror and critical look about how science as a whole needs to repair and rebuild trust with our communities. And then also thinking about how we as an association really have a role to play in the ways that we elevate, value, and build people's careers. And so for us, we've been doing that through a couple different ways. I think some of the most visible ways that AAAS has been doing that, we are in the very wonderful position to have over 40 years of history through some of the most incredible scholars who I stand on their shoulders of, but people like a Dr. Shirley Malcolm, who in the 1970s were making many of these arguments, pushing for greater inclusion, talking about how an emphasis on strategies and individuals was not enough to create change and pave the way for a truly equitable society or system. But not only have we had that history, I think there's a double-edged sword there. And at AAAS, we have said, okay, so we've had this history and where have we made impact? And we do have some evidences of that impact, but that's led us into this space of saying, we can't just do strategies. We can't just support women in chemistry through our L'Oreal program. And we can't just support scholars of color through our Emerging Researchers Network. We can't just support HBCUs through trying to shine a light on their innovation and economic comparative. We also have to do work around systemic change. And so for us, that's led to us taking on programs like Sea Change, where we work specifically with institutional leaders across higher education to build in them the capacity to revolutionize their organizations and institutions so that they can make the systemic change that is necessary to include all individuals in STEM and beyond. And then another part of that is for us to practice what we preach. And so while we're encouraging organizations and systems and structures to undergo those systemic change processes, we have to make sure that we're not being hypocritical in doing that internally. And so we've done a very in-depth and public process around using data and benchmarking to look at what are our systems for publishing, how are we showing diversity of both authors and submitters, the review committees for our peer-reviewed journals, how do we do that ethically, responsibly, all in an effort to have the best, most high-quality science available, because we know that diverse scientific groups and diverse systems produce the best science. Thinking about that in our programs with issues, with wonderful initiatives like Sea Change, our work in Dozer, where we really focus on building relationships with religious communities and other ethical groups and human rights frameworks. And even also thinking about that from not just an external programming space, but also with the engagement of our members. How is our leadership composed? Who gets to make decisions? We've been undergoing a governance modernization process specifically to make sure that our own structures are equitable. How do we decide who gets an award, who gets a fellowship, who gets spotlighted? And are we ensuring that those processes, which are hugely career building, are actually inclusive and not just in a kind of optics way, but in the actual structure. And so that has led to, for the first time in our history, having an entire executive board of women leading our organization, and predominantly women of color, and making those changes so that we actually have the true reflection of science in the fabric of our being. Is part of that process for us. And we still have a long way to go. I'm shouting out a lot of really exciting things that have happened, but we have much more room to continue doing this work and with our members who are vital to it.
Thank you, Dr. York. And Dr. Mealy, you sort of began us by raising the internal and external work that APSA is doing. So I was wondering if you could also respond to how you see APSA building on EDI onto the human rights framework, and also then to transition to how you see scientific disciplines and associations collaborating to advance EDI. So if you could address both of those points.
Thank you. So I'm really heartened to hear the work that is going on in our cognate associations, and I look forward to working with everyone in the future. So APSA has a longstanding Department of Diversity and Inclusion. Diversity, equity, inclusion is one of the overarching priorities that's written into the APSA values statement, the mission, as well as the strategic plan. And we're working each day to make sure that we're able to promote that work and to make sure that it's real work that we're doing. We work very closely as well with status committees and with the ethics committee and with the ombuds that was mentioned earlier. We do view these committees as part of the governance of the association and as key elements that help us to make sure we're advancing DEI work in a human rights perspective. We engage with scholars from minority serving institutions, and we've just begun a new project to expand the outreach to scholars who are working and teaching at minority serving institutions. And we also provide funding and grants for scholars from underrepresented backgrounds to maintain and to continue the work that they are doing. I'll also say that we have a research department that collects demographic data of the members as well as program participants. This data is publicly available, and we know that it's being used by our members to leverage their departments to make sure that they can increase and enhance and move forward their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The majority of the work that we do within the Diversity and Inclusion Department focuses on recruitment and retention, resource provision, and education. In particular, there are two programs that we consider flagship programs for the association. One is the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, organized in 1986, and the second is the Diversity Fellowship Program, which was organized and founded in 1969. Both of these programs were created by efforts that were led by Black political scientists, namely Dr. Jewel Prestage, who in the late 1960s put forward an evidence-based report calling upon the association to create more inclusion and more spaces for scholars of color, namely African-American scholars, and for their contributions, and also for the association to provide intentional and actual support to increase the number of Black graduate students in the profession. Over the last year, as I mentioned earlier, the association leadership and the staff have been working collaboratively on a presidential task force and to address systemic inequities. The task force will be publishing their evidence-based report and their recommendations at the end of December of this year. And we're looking forward to receiving those recommendations and looking forward to working towards implementing them. So that's a part of the work that my colleagues have been talking about as well, that we are also embarking upon, which in some instances is kind of new work for us as we begin to do more self-reflection and also an equity audit of the association and the policies and the processes. As was mentioned by our lead speaker, it's important to realize that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 provides some very baseline guidance for scientific organizations who are seeking to identify DEI values that they can promote within their disciplines. Political scientist, activist, and diplomat, Dr. Ralph J. Bunche was instrumental in drafting the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration. Bunche was the first African American to earn a PhD in political science and the first African American to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was also the first Black president of the American Political Science Association in 1954. APSA's DEI work is built upon a human rights framework, and we're looking to make sure that we move more so into that work, in that framework in the future. We embrace Article 1's declaration that all are born free and equal in dignity. Article 2's statement that all are entitled to these rights regardless of their demographic background or country of origin. Article 7 states that all are equal before the law and entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Article 27 guarantees the right to enjoy scientific advancement and its benefits. I argue and hope that we can move forward in this direction, that all forms of systemic racism, sexism, harassment, discrimination, marginality, and systems that perpetuate these particular forms of oppression pose a threat to the right to science and a threat to human rights. Article 28 states that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which these rights and freedoms can be fully realized. This particular article can also serve as a reminder that the culture and climate of our disciplines, of our associations, of our departments must be free from harassment, from discrimination, from racism, and from bias, so that scientists can enjoy the full realization of the right to science and equal protection for all. And I do believe that associations have a very important role to play in this particular endeavor. Human rights is based upon respect, justice, and equal protection and inclusion. These are values that are also the cornerstone of work that involves equity, diversity, and inclusion. All scientists should be able to engage in the scientific enterprise without being subjected to human rights violations along the way. And now I will turn to the final question, which is how do scientific disciplines and associations collaborating to advance EDI as a human rights issue? Historically, the concept of collaboration amongst deliberative bodies and organizational actors has been at the heart of securing and maintaining the protection of human rights. The Universal Declaration states that member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect for observance of human rights and for fundamental freedoms. I believe that the scientific disciplines and the associations can only benefit from increased cooperation that is both equitable and inclusive on the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion as a human right. And I'm heartened to hear, again, the statements that are brought here to this panel by the panelists and the work that is being done. We must continue to advocate for this form of collaboration in the interassociational spaces and consortium convenings that we all attend. We must also recognize our colleagues, encourage our colleagues to bring these issues to their own governing boards and to update their governance documents so that they reflect the strategic priority of equity, diversity, inclusion work. Advancing diversity, equity, inclusion also advances human rights and vice versa. Higher levels of diversity and inclusion improve group decision-making, leads to more innovative problem solving, and it is incumbent upon the scientific community to join our best efforts to make strategic commitment that will benefit us all. If we are truly committed to advancing human rights for all, we must engage each other in strategic ways that seek to bring out transformational change in deed as well as in word, in the professional culture and climate for scientists and students in our disciplines. Many of our students who are political scientists and many of our faculty, as I mentioned earlier, study and focus on human rights. And so we must engage these scholars and support their particular research and have them help the association and have the association do the work to move forward with these important values. We can leverage our collaborative enterprises to create evidence-based models and frameworks that are inclusive and equity-focused, and then develop a pathway for communicating the DEI-infused human rights approach to the public, to policymakers, and to leaders and stakeholders at academic institutions in such a way that communicates that diversity, equity, inclusion is a basic human right, and we must promote it and make sure that we're able to support it.
Thank you, Dr. Mealy. I'm going to ask Drs. Akbar and York to also talk about sort of the collaboration between disciplines and associations and to briefly share your thoughts. Dr. Akbar, would go first.
Thank you. I think that when we're talking about EDI in terms of human rights, we have to think about it in terms of the advancement of a multi-layered complex issue that requires a multidisciplinary solution. It is not something that any one of us independently can do without the other. That interconnectedness is so important, and for us to be able to challenge specific areas. I'm just going to talk about a few that I see that I can highlight during this conversation, but you all know that there are many that if we took a multidisciplinary approach, we could really have a lot of traction. Let's take climate change. And if we all looked at our perspective science, thinking about the vulnerabilities to low socioeconomic status in diverse communities, what could it look like if we challenge poor air quality? If we, advocated for greater centralization of good water, to every citizen. If we looked at the sparse healthcare coverage and thought of ways that we can provide coverage to everyone as a issue of human rights. And if we were to look at the brunt of natural disasters and other things such as pandemics, well, let's talk about pandemics, right? Let's talk about COVID. Imagine if we came together and thought about this from a multidisciplinary perspective, the intersections between our disciplines, and we saw this as a moment to be able to think back about how history is repeating itself, how we have seen the impacts of racism in the Tuskegee syphilis study, and the political divide that undermined vaccine administration when we were trying to take a hold of this pandemic. So there are so many opportunities. Imagine if we looked at the refugee crisis and we came together to support the well-being of immigrants and refugees, and including providing them with appropriate medical care, mental health services, and other types of social services. And lastly, imagine if we came together to challenge and to make sure that we are advocating strongly for gender equality and LGBTQ plus rights in our community, calling for things such as the Department of Education to ensure that schools are free from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, sexual stereotypes, or sexual characteristics. Imagine if we came together as disciplines that understand how to dismantle these systems and recreate them in a way where we can powerfully change together what a new world anchored in human rights could look like.
It'd be amazing, Dr. Akbar.
Yeah.
Dr. York.
Yeah, that's the type of collaborative and collective impact change that we really need. And I want to echo my colleagues' comments again. I literally can scratch off climate change, health disparities, and pandemic. I would add rural access to broadband, in particular because of it's the right to information and understanding that I think we still have to really kind of make sure that we are working together on, because in particular with the advances that we have around technology and supplemental education, that I think is a mechanism for increasing people's access to STEM learning, to knowledge, to talent development pathways. And I think that's part of how we continue to restore the the trust of the public in science. I echo my colleagues' comments here. I'll add just a couple quick things. There are a couple ways that we're currently doing this, I think, in really exciting ways, and I just want to use those as examples for how we can continue these collaborations. So AAAS, along with several other science societies, responded to the National Academies of Sciences landmark report around sexual assault in STEM by creating the Societies Consortium, which many of our groups are already a part of. That, to me, is a great example of one of the ways that we collaborate to build a more inclusive and more just STEM ecosystem, really looking at the ways that our colleagues have not been treated equitably and fairly, so that their science and their contributions can be, so that the world can benefit from their genius and science and contribution. The other thing that I would point out is, I think many of us are doing, we're kind of pioneering some of this space really thinking about what does it look like for us to evaluate our baseline data? What does it look like for us to be transparent and public about that, our history, and how we move forward, not just with statements, but as all of my colleagues have said, with actions that really propel change. I know for AAAS, part of the way that we've been doing that is we have taken the concept of self-assessments, which we have been building across for institutions to stimulate and sustain institutional change. That's a collaboration that AAAS already did with another association, this one, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. But we have now taken that self-assessment for equity and diversity, and we are now piloting with 4 of our partner science associations a form of that self-assessment that is targeted to STEM, academic, professional, and disciplinary societies. Our whole goal with this is we're not trying to own that space. We just want to create the lessons that we're learning in doing this sort of self-assessment and make it freely available, because we believe that all science associations have to go through this process. And so if we can make resources available from the fumbling around in the dark that we've been doing in this space, we want to make that available. So we're piloting with our partners to build a self-assessment to specifically to help science and STEM societies and associations think about how their own processes can be evolved, deconstructed, or reconstructed and reimagined to build a more equitable STEM future. The last thing I would add here.
I'm sorry, Dr. York. I'm going to ask you to hold that last point, and we will return to it later. I just want to thank the 3 of you. It's so exciting to hear about how your associations are approaching the work at the intersection of EDI and human rights. And I'd like to bring up our final speaker. So thank the 3 of you very, very much. Our final speaker is Jackie Patterson, and she will explain how on-the-ground EDI can be based on a human rights framework. Thank you so much, Ms. Patterson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. So yes, it's great to be able to follow the previous speakers, because they really set such a foundation for my, well, it will be brief remarks, and I appreciate the opportunity to really bring the on-the-ground perspective. So as has already been very well demonstrated, that the equity, diversity, and inclusion is critical to advancing human rights. It's well known that those who are closest to the problem are best poised to define the effective solutions. It is also well known that our failure to recognize that historically, in terms of putting power in the hands of those who have caused the problems, is really what's gotten us to where we are now in terms of being in the crosshairs of this syndemic, and combining the climate crisis, the economic crisis, the racial reckoning, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic. So from the macro to the micro levels, we see the carnage of the many examples of the failure to center people on the front lines in decision-making on human rights. As practitioners, we see the J for justice, as was indicated earlier, as an inextricable measure in the EDI framework. And so we really do hold to the JEDI framework. In the words of the spoken word duo Kleiman Poetry, as we think of JEDI in the context of human rights, the questions around JEDI become who pays and who gets paid, who decides and who is subject to those decisions, who dominates and who is oppressed. And this is really unfortunately the dichotomy that we see in our society. And thinking of really just a handful of the human rights, the human right to all beings being free and equal. When we think about the founding of the United States of America, and in the context of the Trail of Tears and the slave trade, it is founded on the oppression and the enslavement of and the dehumanization and inequities. So with people being driven off of their land via murder, displacement, theft of the land in terms of the indigenous people, and then people being literally stolen from their generational wealth, homes, culture, land, to then being brought over as cargo in the hulls of ships to become the generational wealth that has built this country in its infrastructure through enslavement. So when we really start there and recognize that so many of our systems are built on this, it's really only through the Jedi approaches that we can to right these historical wrongs. When we think about the right to democracy, again, from micro to macro, everything from the Flint, Michigan situation, when it was the displacement of the democratically elected mayor and city council, and then the replacement with the emergency financial manager whose only role was to balance the books with no regard to human rights. It was just regard to balancing the books that ended up in the poisoning of an entire generation. And we see how this is playing out with voter suppression and the fact that we really are living in far from a democracy and really more of a corporatocracy as we continue to see the many examples of the sway that moneyed interests have over our legislatures and our legislators. When we think about right to trial, the notion of the right to being innocent until proven guilty, no unfair detainment, and the very right to life. The families of Ahmaud Arbery, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, George Floyd will all tell a tale of how there's certainly unequal protection under the law and unequal achievement of those very rights. When we think about who is given the right to same law and the right to being treated fairly by the courts, we think about who is given that right and who isn't. I just came back from Alaska, where the Red Dog mines and the owners of those mines have been allowed to violate the Clean Water Act 800 times and counting. And that really tells us really who's being favored by the law and who's actually being suppressed by the law, and who's subject to a 3 strikes law and who has an 800 strikes and counting. And when we have policies passing like Citizens United that upholds this notion of corporate personhood, then it's really the antithesis of any notion of Jedi. When we think about the rights to decent living conditions, the tales of 23,000 people in Baltimore having their water shut off for non-payment, folks in Detroit having their water shut off for non-payment, water which is essential for life. We wrote a report with the NAACP called Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shut-Off Policies as if Human Rights Matter, that talked about the people who lost the right to, again, decent living conditions through energy, basically paying the price of poverty with their very lives. When people had their homes burned down by candles, when they had their electricity cut off, people had their homes burned down by space heaters when they had their oil and gas cut off, and so forth and so on. When we talk about the right to food, and again, in the decent living conditions, the Feed the Hungry statistics that came out with all the people, we remember the images of all the people in those lines in the context of COVID-19, and just shows how, the shock to society really revealed the number of people who are living on the edge and how that disease put everyone over the edge and resulted in those long lines. And it really just visibilized the hidden rot in our society that has been affecting many people for a very, very long time. We put out a report called Cold-Blooded: Putting Profits Before People, where we talked about the right to clean air and how unequal that is. 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. An African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. We wrote a report called In the Eye of the Storm, where we talked about the displacement that happens post-disaster, which for some is temporary, but for many is permanent. And that's if you live to tell the tale. And so there's so many examples when we talk about Jedi also. A lot of times we're talking about in the context of race, but in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, I saw how in the sheltering system, how the gender binary resulted in some people who didn't define themselves on either end of this false binary and ended up not being sheltered because the shelter system required you to identify one way or another. I experienced ableism. I ended up being the sign language interpreter for the Disaster Recovery Center after Hurricane Katrina, even though I knew a couple of signs and a whole lot of finger spelling. So it was extremely inadequate, but yet the system wasn't set up for it, even though there was a large hard of hearing population that was impacted. And on the negative side, before I turn to the positive, is when we talk about the right to asylum. The U.S. is 40% of the global population, yet responsible for 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. And so many of the people who are coming seeking seeking refuge, either are because their lands have dried up, because disaster has driven them from their homes, or because of other political situations. And so many of them are tied, of these political situations are tied to resource wars that are driven by this disruption in our ecosystem. And so instead of providing refuge, instead of welcoming people in this land of abundance, contrary to the false narrative of scarcity, we welcome people by putting their children in cages. We welcome people by being on horseback and using the reins as whips. There's a Kenyan-born Somali poet named Warshan Shire who said that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. But on the positive end, I'll talk fast, so here we're wrapping up, is we are seeing the rise of JEDI in the new leadership of an emerging inclusive economy rooted in true democracy. We're seeing new formations born of the recognition that it's not just enough to have a seat at the table. We have to have the power to decide who else is at the table, what's on the menu, when dinner is being served and by whom, and who is writing the post-meal review. And so it's wonderful to hear the examples from the panelists of how the various associations are leading with JEDI in their work. And some of the other efforts that are happening on the ground include the work of We the People of Detroit in Detroit that are really working on making sure that the right to water is one that's afforded to all. A group called Move to Amend is pushing back on Citizens United and saying that we all need to be treated fairly by the court instead of the courts handling defining corporations as people and then providing privileged status to those people of the otherwise known as corporations. Efforts like the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector is making sure that whether it's in academia, in architecture, that as we're making a move to a society that has buildings that are where we live, sleep, work, play, and so forth, are healthy, are disaster resilient, are energy efficient, and are sustainable for a society that is facing global warming. Groups like the Right to the City Land Back movement are making sure that we right the wrongs of people being driven off of their land or driven away from having housing security and so forth. The Soul Fire Farm, Earthsea Collective are making sure that people have the decent living conditions that includes having access to healthy and affordable foods. Again, in this regenerative planet that we live on, where food is constantly and abundantly being regenerated. If we do it right, if we live in harmony with the land, they're recognizing that and anchoring local food movements. We saw how democracy was saved by Black women in Alabama and Georgia. And we see groups like Emerge that are supporting having people in office that actually represent their constituency. As a result, we're seeing people like Deb Haaland being appointed to the Department of the Interior out of the Native movement and really advancing the right to self-determination. We're seeing, as people have talked about academia, we're seeing the collaborations between academia and community through the collaboratory and communiversity models. Green 2.0 recognized that the lion's share of people who are in leadership in environmental organizations, a multi-billion-dollar kind of industry in the nonprofit industrial complex, are dominated by white males in many ways, and recognizing and putting forth efforts and methodology to diversify. We see groups like FEMA that's standing up an Office of Civil Rights that used to be in the shadows and now is in the foreground, and working with people like the LGBT Health Task Force and so forth. FERC is now developing an Office of Public Participation to make sure that we actually have democracy versus a situation where FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where previously you'd have 99-1 people opposing permits, but the vast majority of permits would be granted regardless of that. And so recognizing that and righting that wrong. The Environmental Protection Agency is standing up the White House Environmental Justice Task Force and so forth and so on. So these are just some examples of where JEDI is really holding up human rights and again, adding to the comments said by all. So I will turn it back to Sherry and in my comments there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And as we close out today's panel, I'd just like to share my email address with the folks in the audience. because we did not have a chance to have a Q&A, and you can send your questions to me and I will ferret them out to the panelists. So my email address is smiles@apa.org. That's smiles@apa.org. We hope you have a clearer vision of the connections between human rights and EDI. Thank you to the panelists today, and I'd also like to thank Nate Weisenberg, Teresa Harris, the AAAS Human Rights Coalition, Dr. Gabe Tews, the Public Interest Human Rights Team, and the AVIX team for all of your support today. Thank you all so much for joining us.